On March 14, 1853, inside a small parish courthouse along the Mississippi River in Louisiana, a transaction took place that would vanish from public record for more than a century. A pregnant woman was sold, not for $12 but for 12 cents, the cost of a loaf of bread. The sale was legal, witnessed by 7 men whose signatures still stain the deed of sale. Yet her name never appeared in any registry before or after that day. When local historians discovered the forgotten receipt in 1897, sealed inside a wall during courthouse renovations, they were horrified by what was written on its reverse. Choosing silence over truth, they resealed it, ensuring the story would sleep a little longer. But history has a way of resurfacing, and the story that Louisiana tried to bury now demands to be told. That March morning was no accident of chaos, but a deliberate act of cruelty, perfectly legal under Louisiana's pre-Civil War laws. St. Helena Parish in 1853 was a world heavy with Spanish moss and the scent of sugarcane smoke. Daylight struggled through thick branches, the humid air tasted of river silt. The wealth of the land was counted not in acres or coin, but in human bodies. Between Baton Rouge and the Mississippi border lay a fertile crescent of plantations whose prosperity depended on silence and suffering. The parish seat, Greensburg, was a quiet cluster of whitewashed buildings arranged around its courthouse square. Every Saturday, that square turned into an auction ground. Furniture, livestock, parcels of land, and enslaved people exchanged hands with bureaucratic precision. Each sale was conducted like a sacred rite, sanctioned by law, sanctified by custom, and witnessed by men who believed themselves the architects of civilization. Among these men of power stood 3 figures who ruled the parish's fate: Judge Amos Crenshaw, plantation owner Duncan Fairholme, and parish recorder Nathaniel Puett. Judge Crenshaw, 62 and gray as the courthouse stone, had spent 40 years interpreting laws that valued property above life. His rulings shaped the parish like a slow, moving river shapes its banks, inevitable, indifferent. Beneath him in rank but not ambition was Duncan Fairholme, a 47-year-old planter who controlled more than 4,000 acres of cotton. Educated in Charleston and fluent in French, Duncan wore refinement as armor but governed through fear. His estate, Bellamont, was run by Silas Guthrie, an overseer infamous for cruelty so severe that his reputation alone kept people obedient. The youngest of this unholy trinity was Nathaniel Puett, the parish tax assessor and recorder of deeds, a man hungry for recognition in a society where family lineage determined worth. Puett had drifted from Virginia with forged letters of introduction and an opportunist's smile, reinventing himself in a land that rewarded ruthlessness. These 3 men would intersect on that gray March morning because of one woman whose existence they later tried to erase completely. Her name was Clara, though even that is uncertain. Records differ, spellings blur. She had been born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia about 23 years earlier, though no precise date was ever written down. Enslaved births seldom were. At 15, she had been sold south, torn from her mother and 2 siblings on a hot August day in Richmond. The man who bought her was Edmund Fairholme, Duncan's father, who later died of cholera, leaving his property, including 47 enslaved souls, to Duncan. Clara worked in the main house at Bellamont. Intelligent and capable with numbers, she had secretly learned to read despite the law's forbiddance. Her quiet dignity drew Duncan's notice, first curiosity, then resentment, finally obsession. By October 1852 she was pregnant, though she never spoke the father's name. She didn't need to. Everyone at Bellamont already knew the father was Duncan's younger brother, William Fairholme. William was everything Duncan was not: gentle, idealistic, and deeply uneasy about the system that enriched his family. Living in the overseer's cottage, he spent evenings reading abolitionist literature smuggled from New Orleans. His bond with Clara began with conversation, grew into trust, and finally became forbidden love. When her pregnancy became visible, William defied convention and begged Duncan to let him buy her freedom. Duncan refused, furiously. To him, his brother's plea was an unforgivable insult, a threat to property law and racial hierarchy alike. What Duncan did next was both cunning and cruel. He arranged to sell Clara publicly at the next courthouse auction, March 14, among seized properties and livestock, ensuring the event appeared routine, but he set her minimum bid at 12 cents. In a world where a woman of her age and health might fetch $1,000, 12 cents was deliberate humiliation. It signified that she was worthless to him, an object of scorn. No serious buyer would risk even that token. The price implied disease or defect. Duncan's intention was clear. Only one man would dare bid, his overseer, Guthrie, who would ensure that Clara's remaining life would be an unending punishment. The night before the sale, William disappeared. Some said he drowned himself in the Mississippi, others that he fled north to join abolitionists. Rumors whispered darker possibilities, that Duncan had him killed and buried among the unmarked graves of the enslaved. In truth, William had gone to Judge Crenshaw's house before dawn, offering every dollar of his inheritance to invalidate the sale. The judge listened impassively, then asked only one question: "Did your brother sign the proper deed?" When William admitted he had, Crenshaw replied, "Then the transaction is legal." Those words sealed Clara's fate more firmly than any chain. That night, Clara sat in the slave quarters among women who braided her hair and sang ancestral songs carried across oceans in slave ships. An old cook named Bethy pressed a tiny knife into her palm. "Hide this," Bethy whispered. "Use it when the time comes." Clara understood. The blade was not for defense but for mercy, a last escape if suffering grew unbearable. She stitched it into the hem of her dress with trembling hands. The morning dawned gray, the sky heavy as the mood of the courthouse square. About 40 people gathered for the auction, more interested in livestock than in a single pregnant woman. Recorder Pewitt read the deed aloud in a monotone. Female, age approximately 23, literate, with child, minimum bid 12 cents. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Clearly, something was wrong with this lot. Guthrie stood near the front, prepared to fulfill Duncan's plan. Then a stranger's voice cut through the silence. "I bid 12 cents, the man said, heads turned. He was tall, thin, travel-worn, a stranger named Isaiah Mercer. Guthrie hesitated, thrown off script. The bidding escalated. 13 cents, 20, 5, 50 cents, $1. The crowd buzzed at $10. Guthrie stopped. His orders were to stay discreet. The gavel fell, sold to Isaiah Mercer for $10. As Mercer counted out his coins, Clara met his gaze and saw something unsettling: recognition. He knew her. Under the heavy clouds of that March afternoon, Isaiah Mercer led Clara away from the courthouse square, while Duncan Fairholme watched from the window of his office, confusion tightening his jaw. The stranger's arrival had not been part of his careful plan. Mercer's steps were measured, his posture calm, his tone steady when Duncan called out to confront him. "You're not from this parish," Duncan said, and Mercer replied simply, "I am not." There was something unsettling about the man's confidence. He spoke like someone accustomed to authority but carrying the roughness of travel. When Duncan pressed him for his intentions, Mercer's response was quiet but firm. His business was his own, and the sale had been witnessed and signed. There was no legal ground for interference. Duncan had no choice but to let him go, though every instinct warned him that something was amiss. As the wagon rattled away, Clara's thoughts swirled with confusion and fear. The stranger who had bought her for $10 had spared her from Guthrie, yet she did not trust him. She sat silently in the wagon bed, the cold iron of uncertainty weighing heavier than her chains. The road wound north, past fields where enslaved workers still bent under the sun, past the white steeple of the parish church, into forests that swallowed the light. Only when the town had disappeared behind them did Mercer finally speak. His voice was softer now, almost careful. "You do not remember me," he said, and Clara's answer came slowly, wary. "Should I?" His reply was a name and a memory that froze her blood. Richmond, 1845, the auction where she had been torn from her mother. He told her he had been there that day, working for a slave trader named Ephraim Dalton, that he had watched her sold to the Fairholmes and had done nothing. She remembered the faces of the men who had stood on that platform, laughing as her mother screamed, but she did not remember him. "Then you are no different than the rest," she said bitterly, but Mercer's eyes remained fixed on the road. "I was no different," he said. "I am no longer that man." From his coat he drew a folded paper, a deed of manumission with her name written upon it, her freedom if signed. Her hands trembled as she held it. "I do not understand," she whispered. Mercer explained in a voice filled with old guilt. He had once been a driver for the traders, complicit in the machinery of slavery, but something in him had broken years ago after witnessing a man's slow death at the hands of his employer. He had fled north and joined abolitionists. 3 months earlier, a man named William Fairholme had come to a meeting in Cincinnati, desperate for help. He spoke of a woman in Louisiana, pregnant and doomed to be sold to a cruel overseer. He had provided the date and place of the auction, had offered his last savings to anyone who could save her. Mercer had taken the task. "William sent me," he said. "He paid me to take you north to Illinois to freedom." Clara's heart twisted. For a brief, shining moment, she allowed herself to believe. But her hope shattered when Mercer's voice faltered as he added, "He died 2 weeks ago. Fever, they said," though Mercer's tone carried doubt. William had been trying to secure passage for others when he fell ill, and some suspected that the illness had been arranged. Clara knew instantly. "Duncan killed him," she said flatly. Mercer did not deny it. The wagon rolled through the wilderness and silence pressed between them. For Clara, the word freedom felt hollow now, tainted by loss, by uncertainty, by the knowledge that every promise in her life had been made by men with power over her. Yet she studied Mercer, the lines of his weathered face, the sincerity beneath his shame, and could not decide if he was her rescuer or her captor. As the road turned rough and narrow, her instincts began to whisper warnings. The timing of the auction, the precision of Mercer's arrival, the ease with which he had outbid Guthrie, none of it felt like coincidence. Duncan Fairholme was not a man who made mistakes. What if this entire escape had been part of his plan? What if Duncan had engineered the illusion of rescue to ensure her suffering took on a new shape? The thought chilled her. Mercer talked of safe houses and sympathetic families, of a journey that would take weeks through back roads and forests, but his voice began to sound rehearsed, like someone reciting a script. By nightfall they camped in a clearing deep within the woods, far from any settlement. Mercer built a small fire and offered her food, but she ate without tasting it, watching him from across the flames. When his breathing deepened and his hat dipped over his eyes, she silently reached into the hem of her dress and drew out the knife Bethy had given her. Its edge glinted in the firelight. She could kill him now and run, but where would she go, pregnant, alone, penniless in a land where every road belonged to slave catchers? The blade trembled in her hand. Finally she spoke into the stillness. "I know this isn't real," she said. Mercer stirred, eyes opening slowly. "Explain," he said evenly. "Duncan planned this," she whispered. "He wanted me to think I was escaping, wanted me to fail. You're part of that plan." The silence stretched before Mercer sighed, his voice calm but stripped of pretense. "You're smarter than William gave you credit for." Her pulse quickened. "So I'm right?" "Partly," he admitted. "Yes, Duncan knows. Yes, he planned for the escape to fail. But you're wrong about why I'm helping him." "Then why?" she demanded. "Because if I didn't, someone else would. And they would hurt you in ways I wouldn't allow." He leaned closer to the firelight, and she saw exhaustion behind his eyes. "Duncan gave me a choice," he said. lead you north and let his men intercept us without harming you, or refuse. He'd hand the job to men who enjoy breaking people. I chose to give you a chance. Clara laughed bitterly. A merciful betrayal. Mercer didn't flinch. A chance, he repeated. He told her that 4 men would intercept them tomorrow, armed with papers and warrants. But there was a narrow window for her survival. From his saddlebag, he produced a leather pouch containing money and a letter of introduction. This will get you south, not north, he explained, to New Orleans, then by ship to Mexico. North is where Duncan expects you to run. South is where he won't look. Clara opened the pouch. Real coins, real hope. Why help me at all? She asked. Mercer's answer came quietly. Because I meant what I said. I can't undo what I've done, but I can try to balance it. William wanted you free. I intend to finish what he started. The fire flickered between them. For the first time since the courthouse, she believed he might be telling the truth. Yet she knew the road ahead would test every ounce of courage she possessed, because even mercy, in Louisiana, came wrapped in danger. Forest was still dark when Clara awoke. The fire had burned down to faint embers, and the mist that clung to the ground made the world seem distant and unfamiliar. Mercer was already awake, sitting near the wagon with his back against a tree, staring toward the faint line of dawn. The night conversation had changed something between them, not trust, not yet, but a fragile understanding built on necessity. Clara's thoughts circled around Mercer's confession, around Duncan's plan, and the terrible possibility that her so-called escape was nothing more than a cruel performance. Yet if Mercer spoke the truth, if he had truly prepared an alternate route south, then this might be her only chance. The knife still rested in her lap, wrapped in a piece of cloth, a reminder of what survival demanded. When Mercer rose, brushing the dirt from his coat, he said only, "We should move. We have little time." The road north stretched ahead like a trap waiting to spring, but Clara followed him because there was nowhere else to go. The morning air was cold, laced with the damp sweetness of pine. As they traveled, Mercer outlined his plan again, every detail timed with a soldier's precision. By afternoon, he said, Duncan's men would appear, 4 of them, armed and sanctioned by Judge Crenshaw. They would carry false papers declaring her a fugitive and voiding the sale. Clara would be taken back to Bellamont, and the story of her failed escape would spread like wildfire, reinforcing Duncan's power. But Mercer intended to change that script. He described a settlement a few miles south, a hidden community of free black families and poor whites who kept to themselves, a place invisible to the parish authorities. There lived a woman named Ruth Chambers, dying of consumption, whose family had agreed to help. Clara was to take the pouch of money, walk south to the settlement, and hide there until the search moved north. Ruth, Mercer explained, would take Clara's place in the wagon, disguised beneath her shawl and bonnet. When Duncan's men intercepted them, they would seize Ruth, believing she was Clara. By the time they realized their mistake, Mercer said, "You'll be far away." Clara stared at him, disbelief warring with horror. "She'll die," she said. "Ruth will die in my place." Mercer's eyes softened. "She's already dying," he replied quietly. "This way her death means something." They reached the settlement just after sunrise. It wasn't a town, not really, just a cluster of cabins circling a shared well, surrounded by pine and silence. The air smelled faintly of smoke and herbs. Children peeked out from doorways as the wagon rolled in, their faces cautious but curious. Ruth Chambers lived in a small cabin at the edge of the clearing, a structure so frail it seemed to lean into the wind for support. Her neighbors cared for her children while she lay confined to bed, too weak to stand. Mercer helped Clara down from the wagon and nodded toward the door. 15 minutes, he said. No more. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through oiled paper over the window. The air was thick with the scent of sage and illness. Ruth lay beneath a thin blanket, her body wasted to bone, her breathing shallow but steady. When her eyes opened, they fixed on Clara with startling clarity. "You are the one," she whispered. Clara moved closer, unsure what to say. "I'm Clara," she answered softly. "They told me you were worth saving," Ruth said. "I wanted to see if that was true." Clara knelt beside her bed. taking in the woman's frail form, the strength still lingering in her gaze. "No one is worth a life," Clara said quietly, her throat tightening. Ruth gave a faint smile. "That's not why I agreed. My children need what Mr. Mercer paid. I'm dying anyway. If I have to go, let it be for something that matters." Her voice was calm, detached from the fear most people carried in their final hours. Clara felt tears pressing against her eyes but forced them back. "Your children, who will care for them?" she asked. "My sister," Ruth said. "The money will feed them through the winter, maybe buy land someday." "That's enough." For a long moment neither spoke. The room was filled only with the rasp of Ruth's breath and the faint crackle of the hearth. Clara reached for her hand. It was cold and fragile, light as a bird's wing. "I'll remember you," Clara whispered. "I'll tell my child about you. Your name won't be forgotten." Ruth's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Names don't matter much where I'm going," she said, her words barely audible. "But if remembering comforts you, then remember. Just promise me one thing, Liv, make sure that baby lives. Don't let me trade my death for nothing." Clara nodded. "I will live," she promised, "whatever it takes." Ruth's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, then opened again with effort. "When they take me tomorrow," she said suddenly, "when Duncan's men come and realize I'm not you, they might threaten me, but they won't hurt me?" "I'll make sure of that." Clara frowned, not understanding. Ruth's voice was thin but steady. "Because I'll already be dead." The words hung in the air like smoke. Mercer stepped forward from the doorway. "Ruth and I have discussed this," he said. "The timing must be exact. She has medicine from the settlement doctor. Morphine. She'll take enough to make her death appear natural, to happen during the interception. Duncan's men will have no one to question, no proof of deception. The plan ends with her death." Clara's breath caught. "You're planning for her to die at exactly the right moment." "I'm planning to die on my own terms," Ruth corrected weakly. "The sickness will take me soon anyway. This way I decide when and why." It was both horrifying and brilliant. A dying woman turning her final moments into a weapon against her oppressors. Clara could barely speak. "You've thought of everything?" she whispered. Ruth smiled faintly. "No," she said. "Mr. Mercer thought of everything. I'm just agreeing to it." Then, closing her eyes, she added softly, "Go now, before I start coughing again and ruin this dramatic goodbye." Clara hesitated at the door, words clawing at her throat. She wanted to thank Ruth properly, to promise her that the sacrifice would not be in vain, but nothing she could say would be enough. Instead, she squeezed Ruth's fragile hand once more and stepped outside. The morning sun was sharp and gold, cutting through the haze. Mercer stood waiting, the leather pouch in his hands. "There's a path behind the cabin," he said. "Follow it south 3 miles. It'll bring you to a road. Take it west until you reach a tavern called the Black Swan. The owner's name is Marcus. Tell him Isaiah sent you." He handed her the pouch and the letter again. "Move only at night. Trust no one without the password in that letter. Get to Natchez. From there, a ship to Mexico. Disappear so completely that Duncan spends the rest of his life wondering where you went." Clara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "What about you?" "I'll take Ruth north," Mercer said. "Deliver her to the men, then vanish." His tone was final. Clara looked at him, at the worn lines of his face, at the guilt and determination that lived side by side in his eyes. Words of gratitude felt hollow, so she did the only thing that felt true. She stepped forward and embraced him. For a moment he froze, then his arms came around her, careful and steady. "Thank you," she said. "Survive." He murmured back, "That's all the thanks I need." Clara turned toward the forest path, the trees whispering in the rising wind. She did not look back. She knew that behind her, a dying woman was preparing to trade her last breath for her freedom, and that a man burdened by guilt would face the consequences of his choices. As she disappeared into the shadows, the first light of morning caught on the edge of her knife sewn into her hem. Reminder that survival in this world was always carved by desperate hands. The forest closed around Clara like a living thing, the branches above forming a canopy so thick that sunlight filtered through in fractured beams. Each step along the narrow path south felt heavier than the last. The sounds of morning, distant birds, the rustle of leaves, seemed far away, almost unreal. She walked for hours, guided by the faint directions Mercer had given her, clutching the pouch of money and the folded letter that now felt like the weight of a life she did not yet believe she owned. The forest eventually thinned, giving way to a dirt road lined with wild grass and the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from somewhere ahead. Clara followed it west, her body aching, her dress clinging to her with sweat. The knife hidden in her hem scratched lightly against her leg as she walked, a reminder of both her fear and her will to survive. By midday she reached the tavern Mercer had mentioned, a weathered wooden structure standing alone beside the road, its sign half hanging by one rusted chain. The Black Swan. A horse was tied to the post outside, its saddle still dusted with the red clay of Louisiana backroads. Inside, the tavern was dim, lit by the flicker of a single lantern. A man stood behind the counter cleaning a glass with a rag that looked older than the building itself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hair streaked with gray. When he looked up, his eyes fixed on Clara for a long moment before he spoke. "You're far from home," he said evenly. "I'm looking for Marcus," Clara replied. "Isaiah sent me." The man froze mid-motion, then nodded slightly and gestured toward the back room. "You'd better come with me." The back room smelled of tobacco and damp wood. Marcus closed the door and studied her face in silence. "Isaiah said you'd be coming," he said at last. "Said you might be carrying trouble with you." Clara held out the letter. He unfolded it carefully, reading the coded message scrawled in Mercer's hand. After a moment, he nodded. "All right. You'll stay here until nightfall. Then I'll take you to the river road. There's a woman who can hide you until we find passage south." Clara wanted to ask questions, to know who these people were and why they were willing to risk their lives for her, but the exhaustion pressed too heavily on her body. She simply nodded and sank onto a chair. Marcus poured her a small cup of water and set it before her without a word. Hours passed slowly. Outside, rain began to fall, turning the road into mud and the world into gray mist. The tavern filled briefly with travelers seeking shelter, white men whose laughter and voices made Clara shrink into the corner, her hood pulled low. They spoke of plantations, crops, politics, and war, the careless chatter of men who believed the world would always belong to them. Each time one of them looked in her direction, her pulse quickened. She tried to appear invisible. Marcus moved easily among them, serving drinks and trading jokes, but every few minutes his eyes flicked toward her, making sure she was safe. When evening finally came and the travelers had gone, he returned to her quietly. "Time to move," he said. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The air smelled of wet pine and earth. Marcus led her down a narrow path that wound behind the tavern and through a stretch of low marshland. The ground was soft beneath their feet, sucking at their boots with every step. "The woman's name is Eliza," he said as they walked. "She's a friend to people like you, people who need to disappear. Her place is about 5 miles from here, near the river bend." Clara followed silently, the sounds of frogs and distant thunder filling the air. Every so often Marcus stopped to listen, his hand resting on the handle of the pistol at his belt. Once, far behind them, a horse whinnied, and both of them froze. "Riders," Marcus whispered, "move faster." They reached Eliza's cabin just before midnight. It stood on a rise above the river, its windows dark, the door reinforced with iron hinges. Marcus knocked 3 times, paused, then twice more a signal. A woman opened the door, her face illuminated by a small oil lamp. She was middle-aged, her hair wrapped in a bright scarf, her expression calm but wary. "Isaiah's message said you'd come tonight," she said. Her gaze shifted to Clara. "You're the one from Bellamont." Clara nodded, unsure whether it was safe to confirm. "Come in, child," Eliza said softly. "You're safe here, at least for now." Inside, the cabin was warm and orderly. Herbs hung from the ceiling. A pot of stew simmered on the hearth. Eliza handed Clara a blanket and guided her toward a small cot in the corner. "Rest while you can," she said. "Tomorrow, start early. There's a man with a wagon who will take you farther south, to Baton Rouge. From there, another contact will see you to New Orleans." Clara sat down, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. The warmth and the smell of food made her dizzy with fatigue. "Do you think they'll follow?" she asked. Eliza's eyes darkened. "Men like Duncan Fairholme never stop following. But sometimes God hides us in plain sight." As Clara drifted toward sleep, she thought of Mercer and Ruth. She pictured the wagon heading north, Ruth sitting in her place, her dying body carrying the burden that should have been hers. The thought filled her with gratitude and grief so sharp it hurt to breathe. In her dreams she saw Ruth's face, calm and resolute, whispering, "Don't let my death be for nothing." She woke before dawn, heart pounding, the knife clutched in her hand. Eliza was already awake, packing food into a small bundle. "Eat," she said, handing Clara a piece of bread. "We leave in 10 minutes." They stepped out into the cool gray morning. The road toward Baton Rouge cut through dense cypress groves and open fields veiled in mist. Eliza walked beside her, moving quickly but quietly, always scanning the horizon. "Isaiah said you were carrying a child," she said at last. "You'll need to rest more often." Clara nodded. Her stomach felt heavy, her back sore, but she pushed forward. Every mile south was a mile away from Duncan's reach. Around midday they stopped near an abandoned barn to rest. As Clara sat beneath a tree, Eliza knelt beside her and touched her hand. "You're doing what many never could," she said. "You're walking out of bondage while the world tries to drag you back." They continued until nightfall, when the trees gave way to the faint lights of a small settlement by the river. The wagon Eliza had arranged waited there, its driver a quiet man who asked no questions. Before Clara climbed aboard, Eliza pressed something into her palm, a small silver cross, old and worn smooth by touch. "It belonged to my mother," she said. "She carried it when she escaped from Georgia. It kept her alive. Maybe it'll do the same for you." Clara looked at the cross, then at the woman who had risked everything to help her, and felt the enormity of all the hands that had carried her this far. Mercer's guilt, Ruth's sacrifice, Eliza's quiet courage. She climbed into the wagon, pulling her hood low, and as the driver urged the horses forward, she looked once toward the north, toward the life that had tried to claim her. Somewhere up that road, she knew, a woman was dying in her name, and a man was preparing to face Duncan's wrath alone. Clara turned away. The road ahead was long, but for the first time it belonged to her. The morning that followed Ruth's sacrifice dawned pale and cold, the kind of morning that seemed too quiet, as though the world itself held its breath. On a lonely stretch of road 2 days' journey north, Isaiah Mercer sat on the wagon bench with his hat pulled low, his face expressionless. Beside him, beneath the canvas cover, Ruth Chambers sat in silence, her frail frame hidden beneath Clara's shawl and bonnet, a makeshift pillow tied around her waist to mimic pregnancy. Every creak of the wagon's wheels echoed like a drumbeat of inevitability. Mercer knew what was coming. He had calculated every mile, every hour, every choice that had brought them here, yet knowing did not make it easier. Ruth's breath came in shallow gasps. She had taken part of the medicine already, just enough to dull the pain, not enough to end her life before the moment arrived. He had offered to stop, to let her rest, but she had shaken her head. "We finish what we started," she had whispered, and that was the last thing she said before falling silent again. The road wound through a corridor of cypress trees dripping with moss, their roots tangled in the wet soil. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of mud and decay. Sometime after noon, the distant sound of horses reached Mercer's ears. 4 riders approaching from the north. He did not turn around. He kept the horses steady, his face calm, his pulse steady. When the riders emerged from the bend, he recognized them instantly. The leader, Porter, wore a wide, brimmed hat and the confidence of a man backed by law and violence. Behind him rode 3 others, men with the hard, expressionless faces of professional hunters. They slowed when they saw the wagon, their formation tightening. Porter raised his hand. "Isaiah Mercer," he called out. Mercer reined in the horses and looked up, feigning confusion. "Yes, we have a warrant for the return of fugitive property," Porter said. "A Negro woman named Clara absconded from Bellamont Plantation. She's believed to be traveling with you." Mercer kept his tone even. "I purchased that woman legally, he replied. I have the deed of sale. Porter rode closer, pulling a folded paper from his coat. The deed has been voided. Judge Crenshaw himself declared it fraudulent. You are to surrender the woman immediately. Mercer forced himself to remain calm. She's ill, he said, gesturing toward the back of the wagon. I was bringing her south, you can see for yourself. Porter dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud. He strode to the back of the wagon and yanked aside the canvas. Ruth sat up weakly, her face half hidden by the bonnet. For a moment Porter hesitated. Something about her stillness seemed unnatural. Make her stand, he ordered. Mercer climbed into the wagon, supporting Ruth by the arm as she tried to rise. Her body shook with effort, her breath rattling audibly. The rags tied around her waist shifted, almost convincing in the half-light. She looks wrong, Porter muttered. She's sick. Mercer said evenly, caught the fever on the road. I was taking her back because she can barely breathe. Porter studied her face, suspicion flickering in his eyes. He motioned for one of his men to join him. What do you think, Ridley? James Ridley, a former slave catcher turned hired hunter, leaned forward on his saddle. His eyes were sharp, practiced at measuring people's worth the way other men measured cattle. Hard to tell, he said slowly. Bonnet hides her face, but she don't look like she's worth chasing. Porter turned back to Mercer. This is not her, he said flatly. You're lying. He grabbed Ruth's arm roughly, and she let out a small cry of pain. The bonnet fell back, revealing her face. Her skin was gray, her lips cracked, her eyes already glazing with fever. She swayed, and Mercer caught her before she could fall. You're hurting her, he said quietly. She's dying. Porter released her, stepping back as though her sickness might cling to him. Search the wagon, he barked. The other men dismounted, tearing through supplies, flipping barrels, scattering tools. They found nothing. No second passenger, no hidden compartments, no trace of anyone but the dying woman. When they returned to Porter, their faces were blank. She's gone, one muttered. Porter's expression hardened. Where is she? He demanded. Mercer met his eyes without flinching. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. This is the woman I purchased. If she isn't the one you want, that's not my concern. The men looked uncertain now. Killing Mercer outright would raise questions, and taking the wrong woman back could expose them to Duncan's fury. Porter turned to Ruth again. She was lying on her side now, breathing raggedly. Where is she? He asked again. Ruth's eyes opened slowly, her voice barely a whisper. Gone, she said, beyond your reach, beyond Duncan's. Porter leaned closer. Tell me where she is. A small smile crossed Ruth's lips, the faintest flicker of triumph. You can hurt me, she murmured, but I'll be dead before you learn anything. I made sure of that. The realization hit Porter a second too late. Ruth's skin had turned waxen, her breathing slowing to shallow gasps. Foam gathered at the corners of her mouth, tinged with blood. She had taken the rest of the medicine, the poison meant to ensure her silence. Porter stood frozen as the woman before him began to die, her body trembling once before growing still. You stupid woman, he said, though his voice had lost its edge. You think this helps anyone? Duncan will find her eventually. Ruth's lips parted one final time. Maybe, she whispered, maybe not. Maybe she'll live long enough to see your world burn. The last breath left her body like a sigh, and her eyes, still open, reflected the gray Louisiana sky. No one spoke for a long moment. The only sound was the soft hiss of wind through the reeds. Porter straightened, his face unreadable. Ridley looked down at Ruth's body and then away, something uneasy shifting behind his hardened gaze. We bury her here, Porter said finally. We tell Duncan we found her, but she died before we could question her. We tell him Mercer claimed it was the woman from the auction. We tell him the trail went cold. He'll know we failed, one of the others muttered. Porter gave a bitter smile. He'll know exactly what happened, but he won't be able to prove it. They dug the grave at the edge of the road, the mud dark and heavy, swallowing Ruth's small body like the earth itself wanted to keep her secret. There was no marker, no prayer, only the sound of shovels striking wet soil. Mercer stood apart, silent, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. When it was over, the men mounted their horses and rode south without another word, disappearing into the mist. Mercer remained for a long while, staring at the patch of disturbed ground. Finally, he spoke her name 3 times, Ruth Chambers, Ruth Chambers, Ruth Chambers, as if the repetition could tether her spirit to memory instead of oblivion. When he finally turned away, he knew he could never return to Louisiana. He would head north, send word to his abolitionist contacts that the woman had escaped, and vanish before Duncan's reach found him. But as he walked back to the wagon, the image of Ruth's last smile burned behind his eyes. In that moment, he understood that freedom had not been purchased with the deed or the money in Clara's pouch. It had been bought with the courage of a dying woman who turned her death into defiance. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, and somewhere far to the south, Clara was alive. Whether she reached safety or not, Mercer would never know. But he told himself that Ruth's final act had meant something, that in a world built on cruelty and ownership, one woman's choice to die free had broken the logic of their laws. As the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the dirt from his hands, Isaiah Mercer climbed onto the wagon and whispered to the silence, "You're free now, all of you." Then he drove away, the sound of the wheels fading into the gray Louisiana wilderness. Rain began to fall heavier as Mercer guided the wagon away from the shallow grave, the sky bruised with low clouds that hung heavy over the land. The scent of wet earth and pine filled the air, but nothing could wash away the image of Ruth Chambers' final breath from his mind. Each roll of the wheels against the soaked road sounded like a heartbeat, steady, relentless, echoing the weight of what had just occurred. Ruth was gone, but her defiance lingered, a quiet thunder in Mercer's chest. He rode without destination, his hands trembling faintly on the reins. The swamp on either side of the road seemed endless, trees half drowned in murky water, their reflections shivering on the surface. For hours he rode through that desolation, the rain drumming a rhythm of remembrance, until the light began to fade into a dull, colorless dusk. Somewhere far to the south, he told himself, Clara was walking toward freedom. He repeated that thought like a prayer because the alternative was unbearable, that all this sacrifice might end in vain. As the day darkened, Mercer found shelter beneath an abandoned shed near a field gone to seed. The roof leaked, and the air smelled of rust and mildew, but it offered some protection from the storm. He tied the horse, stripped off his soaked coat, and sat on the wagon bench, staring at the sheets of rain falling beyond the doorway. The loneliness pressed in on him like a living thing. For years he had carried the ghosts of those he had helped enslave, their faces surfacing whenever he closed his eyes. Ruth's face joined them now, but her expression was different. She had not looked at him with accusation or fear, but with quiet understanding. She had known what her death meant and had chosen it anyway. Mercer had seen courage before, but never like that. For the first time in years, he bowed his head and wept, not out of guilt, but out of reverence. By the time the storm broke, night had fallen completely. Mercer knew he couldn't linger. Duncan's men might return to confirm the burial, or worse, Judge Crenshaw might send others to question him. The parish was too small to hide in, and Duncan's influence too large. He loaded the wagon again, keeping only what he could carry, and started north toward Baton Rouge, intending to vanish into the growing network of abolitionist sympathizers he had once known. But his mind drifted constantly to Clara. He pictured her walking through the forest, rain soaking her dress, clutching the pouch and letter. He wondered if she had made it to Eliza, if she had crossed the river yet. He hoped she had found shelter, that the plan had worked, that Ruth's sacrifice had bought her the time she needed. In the shifting shadows of the trees, every shape seemed to watch him, as if the ghosts of the enslaved were walking beside the wagon, silent witnesses to what had been done. Several days later, in Greensburg, Duncan Fairholme received the news of the failed interception. Porter's letter was brief and clinical, describing how the woman had died before questioning, how Mercer claimed she had fallen ill, and how the identity could not be verified. Duncan read the words twice, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully, set it on his desk, and poured himself a glass of brandy. For a long moment, he stared into the amber liquid, his reflection rippling faintly on the surface. Then he smiled, a small, cold curve of the lips. He understood what had happened. Mercer had deceived him. Somewhere, Clara was still alive. The thought did not enrage him. It intrigued him. Cruelty to Duncan was not passion. It was art, and every act of defiance only made the art more elaborate. He would not chase her immediately. That would be expected. No, he would wait. Let her believe she had escaped. Let her build a fragile life somewhere beyond his reach. Then he would find her. Breaking people was always more satisfying when they had first tasted hope. Judge Crenshaw heard of the failed recovery 2 days later when Duncan visited his home. The judge, aging and weary, had begun to question the very system he had spent his life protecting, though he would never admit it aloud. As Duncan paced his study, speaking in calm, clipped tones about betrayal and retribution, Crenshaw felt a flicker of unease. He had signed too many documents like Clara's, had watched too many families torn apart under the pretense of law. He told himself that he upheld order, not cruelty, but even in his dreams now he could hear the auctioneer's voice echoing through the courthouse square. When Duncan demanded that a warrant be issued for Mercer's arrest on charges of fraud, Crenshaw hesitated. "The evidence is inconclusive," he said quietly. "Porter's men cannot confirm the woman's identity." Duncan's eyes narrowed. "Then find someone who can." The judge met his gaze, and, for the first time in decades, refused. "The law has spoken, Mr. Fairholme. The matter is closed." Duncan's expression did not change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. As he left the house, Crenshaw knew he had just signed his own death sentence. Not literally, perhaps, but in influence and reputation. Duncan had a way of erasing those who defied him. In the weeks that followed, whispers spread across the parish. Some said the woman from Bellamont had died of fever on the road. Others said she had escaped to the north, aided by abolitionists. A few claimed they had seen her ghost wandering near the courthouse steps, her eyes bright with vengeance. None of these stories reached Clara, who by then was days into her journey south, hiding among sympathetic families who passed her from one safe house to another. At each stop, she heard fragments of the world she had left behind, the tightening laws, the talk of secession, the growing unease in the South. But she focused only on the next mile, the next night, the next promise of safety. The letter Mercer had given her became worn from being folded and unfolded so often. Each line, written in careful, slanted handwriting, reminded her that she carried not just her own survival, but the weight of everyone who had helped her reach this point. Back in Greensburg, Nathaniel Pewitt, the parish recorder who had read Clara's sale aloud, found himself unable to sleep. He had witnessed countless transactions, men, women, and children sold as property, but the memory of that pregnant woman's calm face haunted him. When he learned that she had vanished, that the sale had become a scandal whispered behind closed doors, guilt began to gnaw at him like rot. One night, after too much whiskey, he confessed to his wife that he feared God would punish them all for what had happened that day. She told him to pray, but his prayers brought no comfort. Within a month he left Greensburg entirely, heading west. Some said he died of fever in Texas. Others believed he changed his name and lived quietly as a clerk in New Orleans. The parish moved on, as it always did, pretending that the 12-cent sale had been just another piece of business. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The courthouse, once a place of order, began to feel cursed to those who worked within it. Records went missing. Documents appeared where none should be. Clerks reported hearing footsteps after dark, the faint sound of a woman's voice humming an unfamiliar tune. Judge Crenshaw stopped attending public gatherings, drinking more heavily, haunted by things he would never admit. Duncan, meanwhile, continued to build his empire, buying new land, expanding his plantations, trying to bury the memory of his brother, of Clara, of everything that had slipped from his control. Yet even in victory, he could not rest. At night, he dreamed of a woman standing in the courthouse square, her hands bound, her eyes defiant, whispering words he could never quite hear. He would wake drenched in sweat, clutching the sheets, and pour himself another drink to silence the memory. But memories like Clara's do not die easily. They linger like the scent of rain in Louisiana soil, waiting for the day they can rise again. The journey south stretched into weeks, each mile a test of endurance and will. Clara traveled mostly by night, moving from one safe house to another under assumed names, always careful to keep her face hidden and her footsteps light. The forests gave way to wide fields and humid marshland, where the air clung to her skin and the cries of night birds echoed through the dark. Each time she reached a new stop, she was met by strangers who spoke softly and moved quickly, people bound together by invisible threads of trust and secrecy. These were the quiet soldiers of mercy, free men and women, preachers, innkeepers, and ferrymen who risked everything to defy the law. Some offered food, others only silence and a place to rest, but every one of them carried the same weary courage that kept the underground roads alive. Clara never asked for their names. It was safer that way. In Baton Rouge, she stayed for 3 nights in the back room of a tailor's shop, owned by a widow named Hattie Bell. Hattie was a tall woman with skin the color of mahogany and eyes sharp enough to cut through deceit. On the first night, she said little. On the second, as they sat by the flickering lamplight sewing a tear in Clara's dress, she finally spoke. "Isaiah told me you were strong," she said, her needle flashing. "Said you were carrying a child?" Clara nodded, her hand resting instinctively on her belly. "Then you're carrying 2 lives," Hattie said quietly. "Don't forget that when the road gets cruel." There was something maternal in her voice, something that reached through Clara's exhaustion and fear like a warm hand in the dark. On the 3rd morning, Hattie packed her a small bundle, bread, a flask of water, a piece of cloth embroidered with the shape of a swan. "Keep this," she said. "It's how we mark our own. If someone shows you this pattern, you'll know you're safe." Leaving Baton Rouge was harder than Clara expected. The city buzzed with tension, soldiers moved through the streets, and rumors of rebellion and war whispered from every corner. She kept to the alleys, her hood drawn low, her eyes never meeting those of the men who shouted at her from porches. The world was changing. She could feel it, though she did not yet understand how deep that change would run. When she reached the outskirts, she boarded a flatboat heading down the Mississippi, paid for with the last of Mercer's coins. The river stretched wide and dark, carrying her away from everything she had ever known. The boatman, a grizzled Creole man named Duval, didn't ask questions. He hummed to himself as he steered through the current, the melody slow and mournful. As the night deepened, Clara leaned against the wooden rail, staring into the shifting black water. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine the future Mercer had promised. A land where no one could claim another person's life, where her child could be born free. The thought was fragile, but it was enough to keep her breathing. When the boat docked near New Orleans, Duval pointed her toward the narrow road leading to a small parish on the city's edge. "You'll find the woman there," he said. "Her name's Magdalene. She runs a boarding house for colored folk. Tell her you're from Isaiah." Clara thanked him and walked until her legs ached. The city loomed in the distance, alive with sound and smoke and the faint promise of anonymity. For the first time since her flight, she was surrounded by people who might not care who she was. Yet fear never fully left her. Every voice behind her made her flinch. Every white face made her heart quicken. But Magdalene's boarding house, when she found it, felt like another world. It was a two-story structure painted a fading yellow, with flowering vines crawling up the porch railings. Magdalene herself was a broad woman with kind eyes and a spine of iron. She ushered Clara inside without a word, locking the door behind them. "You're safe now," she said, her voice low but certain. "Isaiah's word is good here." Life in the boarding house fell into a fragile rhythm. Clara helped Magdalene with chores, sweeping floors, washing linens, and tending to the small herb garden behind the kitchen. The work was simple, grounding. For the first time in months, she slept through the night without waking in terror. The other boarders, dock workers, freedmen, and women who had fled the same chains she once wore, treated her with quiet respect. No one asked about her past, though they all seemed to recognize it in the heaviness of her eyes. Magdalene became her confidante, listening when Clara finally spoke of Mercer, of Ruth, of the long road that had brought her there. "You've seen the worst of what this world can do," Magdalene said one evening as they shelled beans on the porch. "That means the world owes you something better." Months passed, and the child in Clara's belly grew heavy. She began to feel the flutters of life beneath her ribs, tiny reminders that freedom had taken root inside her body. But peace was always temporary. One humid afternoon a man arrived at the boarding house asking questions. He was dressed like a merchant, but his manner was too sharp, his eyes too curious. Magdalene sent Clara upstairs and spoke with him on the porch. Clara couldn't hear their words, but she saw the man's smile, thin, knowing. After he left, Magdalene came upstairs, her face pale. "Pack your things," she said quietly. "He's no merchant, he's hunting." Clara's stomach turned to ice. "Duncan," she whispered. Magdalene nodded. "He hasn't given up, but we won't let him take you." That night, under cover of darkness, Magdalene led her through the narrow streets toward the docks. A ship bound for Veracruz lay moored there, its crew mixed and discreet. The captain owed Magdalene a favor from long ago. "You'll sail with them," Magdalene said. "They'll see you safe across the Gulf." Clara clutched her hand, tears welling in her eyes. "What if he finds me?" "Then you keep running," Magdalene said firmly. "Freedom isn't a place, child. It's the choice to keep moving, even when they want you still." Before dawn, the ship pushed off from the dock. The wind filled the sails, and the city lights faded behind them like the last embers of a dying fire. Clara stood at the stern, the silver cross Eliza had given her cold in her palm, and watched the water stretch endlessly ahead. She didn't know what waited in Mexico, only that it was far from Duncan Fairholme, far from the courthouse square where her life had once been auctioned for 12 cents. The sea air smelled of salt and promise. For the first time, she whispered her child's name aloud, a name she had carried in her heart since the day she escaped. Ruth, after the woman who had died for her. The waves swallowed the sound, but in her heart it echoed like a hymn. Meanwhile, far behind her, Duncan received word from New Orleans that a woman fitting Clara's description had boarded a ship under an assumed name. The letter arrived late at night, and when he read it, he laughed softly to himself. "Let her sail," he murmured. "Even oceans can't keep the past away forever." He folded the paper and tucked it into his coat pocket, already planning the next move. For men, like Duncan, obsession was a form of immortality. But as the years would prove, some ghosts refused to be hunted, and Clara's was destined to outlive them all. The voyage across the Gulf of Mexico was long and merciless, a stretch of days that blurred into a haze of salt, wind, and aching silence. Clara spent most of the journey below deck, lying on a narrow cot that creaked with every wave. The sea was rough, and each swell made her stomach twist, though she no longer knew if it was the motion or the child inside her causing the discomfort. The ship's crew spoke in fragments of Spanish and Creole, their laughter and curses mixing with the crash of water against the hull. She understood little, but she knew kindness when she saw it. The cook, a quiet man with weathered hands, always left extra bread by her bunk. The youngest sailor, barely more than a boy, carved her a small wooden charm shaped like a bird. She kept it near her heart, beside Eliza's silver cross. The small tokens reminded her that, though the world had been cruel, there were still hearts capable of gentleness. At night, when the ship was quiet, Clara would lie awake listening to the sea. It reminded her of the fields back at Bellamont, the endless rustle of wind through sugarcane, but this sound was freer, wilder. Sometimes she imagined Ruth's voice carried in the rhythm of the waves, whispering that she was still watching, still guiding her. She often thought of Mercer, too, and wondered if he had survived. The last she saw of him was that morning in the woods, his face solemn but steady. She hoped he had found peace, though she doubted peace was something men like him ever truly reached. Each night, She whispered a prayer for the dead and the living, for all the souls that had built the fragile bridge carrying her toward freedom. When the ship finally reached Veracruz, the harbor was alive with color and chaos. Men shouted in Spanish, hauling crates and barrels. Women in bright shawls bargained for fruit. Stray dogs wove through the crowd. The air smelled of spice, seaweed, and smoke, a sharp, vivid scent unlike anything she had known. For a moment, Clara stood frozen on the dock, overwhelmed by the noise and motion of it all. She had made it. For the first time in her life, she was standing on soil where no law claimed her as property. The thought was too large to hold, too immense to fully believe. She wanted to laugh, to weep, to fall to her knees and kiss the ground. But she simply stood there, breathing, her hand resting protectively over the curve of her stomach. Freedom didn't feel like triumph, it felt like exhaustion. Magdalene's letter of introduction led her to a small home on the edge of the city, owned by a widow named Senora Alvarez. The woman was stout, kind, dyed, and spoke broken English mixed with gentle Spanish phrases that Clara slowly began to understand. She offered Clara a small room overlooking a courtyard filled with bougainvillea and promised work mending clothes. "Aquí, no masters," the woman said with a smile, "only people." The words struck Clara like sunlight after rain. She nodded, unable to speak for the tightness in her throat. The first weeks in Veracruz passed quietly. She learned enough Spanish to buy food at the market, to greet neighbors, to smile without fear. At night she sat by the window, sewing or writing her thoughts in small scraps of paper she never intended anyone to read. Her belly grew heavier, and Senora Alvarez watched over her like a guardian. But even freedom had shadows. Sometimes in the market she would see men with pale faces and fine clothes, traders, shipmen, travelers from the north, and her heart would seize with terror. Any one of them could be from Louisiana, from Duncan's world, carrying his letters, his bounty posters, his vengeance. She began to dream again, of the courthouse square, of Porter's voice, of Duncan's cold eyes as he signed her sale. Some nights she woke gasping, clutching her stomach, whispering to the child that they were safe. But fear, she learned, does not vanish, it only changes shape. One evening, months after her arrival, she went into labor. It was a stormy night. Thunder rolled over the city, and rain hammered the tiled roofs. Senora Alvarez sent for a midwife, a dark-skinned woman with nimble hands and calm eyes, who arrived just as the pain began to tighten across Clara's body like fire. Hours passed in a blur of agony and memory. Between contractions, Clara thought of Ruth, how she had smiled at death and made it her ally. She thought of Eliza's firm voice, of Hattie's swan embroidery, of Mercer's steady hands. Every face, every kindness became a breath that carried her through the pain, and when the cry finally came, a thin, perfect sound that pierced the storm, Clara broke into tears. The midwife smiled gently. "Una Nina," she said, "a girl." Clara reached out with trembling hands, and the tiny body was placed against her chest. The baby's skin was warm and soft, her small fists curled tightly. "Ruth," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Your name is Ruth." In the weeks that followed, life found a rhythm again. Clara worked in the courtyard while little Ruth slept in a basket beside her. She mended clothes for sailors and families, her fingers quick and steady. The neighbors began to greet her not as a stranger but as one of their own. The world still carried danger. Rumors drifted south about war between the states, about men like Duncan losing their grip on the old order. But for now, the danger felt far away. Every morning, she carried Ruth to the harbor, where gulls wheeled over the water, and whispered stories about the people who had brought them here. "You'll know their names," she told her daughter softly. "You'll know what they did, so you'll understand what freedom costs." Years passed quietly. Ruth grew strong and bright, her hair curling in the humid air, her laughter filling the courtyard. Clara never remarried, though many offered. She had learned that love could be both salvation and snare, and she wanted no man's shadow cast over her freedom or her child's. Instead, she built a small business of her own, sewing for travelers and locals alike. earning enough to buy the room she once rented. Her hands, once bound by ropes and laws, now shaped her own future stitch by stitch. But every year on the same day she walked to the water's edge, stood barefoot in the surf, and spoke the names of those who had carried her here: Isaiah Mercer, Ruth Chambers, Eliza, Hattie, Magdalene. She whispered their names like prayer, her voice carried out to sea. Unbeknownst to her, back in Louisiana, Duncan Fairholme's empire had begun to crumble. The winds of war tore through the South, and men like him, built on blood and arrogance, found their world shrinking. By the time the Union soldiers reached his lands, Bellamont was a shadow of its former grandeur. He fled north under an assumed name, but his wealth and cruelty could not buy him peace. Stories say that in his final years, he raved about a woman standing at the foot of his bed, her eyes calm and her hands cradling a child. Servants whispered that she came each night with the rain, that she never spoke, only stared until he screamed himself awake. When Duncan Fairholme finally died, alone in a boarding room in Memphis, the night was heavy with storm, and somewhere far away on the Veracruz shore, Clara woke suddenly and looked toward the sea. The wind had risen, carrying the faint smell of rain. She smiled faintly, as if sensing that a chapter of her life had just closed, and whispered, "Now it's finished." The waves answered softly, and the dawn broke clean and golden over a land where no one owned her name. Years passed, and time, like the sea, carried both memory and change. By the time Ruth was 10, Veracruz had become home, a place of laughter, labor, and quiet strength. The world beyond Mexico had shifted. News of the war in the north reached even the port markets, carried on sailors' tongues. They spoke of freedom proclaimed and battles fought, of men in blue uniforms marching through southern fields once soaked with blood. Clara listened to those stories in silence, her hands always busy at the sewing table. Sometimes she wondered if Isaiah Mercer still lived to see it, if somewhere he had witnessed the moment the chains finally cracked open. She hoped he had, though she knew that some victories arrived too late for the ones who began them. Still, the thought that others might now walk unbound through Louisiana soil filled her heart with a bittersweet peace. Ruth grew up quick and curious, full of questions about a world she had never seen. "Why did we leave the North Country?" she would ask, her Spanish already more fluid than her English. Clara always answered carefully. "Because the North Country wasn't made for us," she'd say, "not then." Ruth didn't yet understand the depth of that truth. To her, freedom was simply the air she had always breathed, the open sky, the kindness of neighbors, the laughter of Senora Alvarez, who had become like a grandmother. Clara let her believe it for as long as she could. Childhood, she knew, was the only time freedom could ever be taken for granted. In those years, Clara built a small name for herself in Veracruz. Her needlework became known for its precision and quiet beauty, and even the wives of wealthy merchants began to send for her dresses. She saved every peso she could, and by the time Ruth turned 13, they had moved into a modest house near the harbor with blue shutters that caught the morning light. Life was not easy, but it was theirs, earned, unbought, unbroken. Yet, even in peace, Clara carried ghosts. Some nights, when the rain fell heavy against the windows, she would see again the courthouse square, the look on Duncan's face as the sale was read aloud. Sometimes she would dream of Ruth Chambers, her name, say, lying beneath the Louisiana mud, her last smile bright even in death. On those nights, Clara would light a candle in the window and whisper, "I kept my promise, she lives." As Ruth grew older, she began to draw, first with bits of charcoal on scraps of cloth, then with colored pastels given by a sailor who admired her sketches of ships. She had her mother's quiet intensity and something else besides, a curiosity unafraid of the world. By 16, she was painting small portraits for coin, her fingers stained with pigment. "You have your own hands," Clara would tell her. "They'll build you a life I never had." Ruth would laugh softly and say, "Then it's your life too, Mama. You gave it to me." One humid afternoon when Ruth was 17, a traveler came to the sewing shop asking for repairs on a torn coat. He was an older man, gray,